On a bright Tuesday morning, the bustling terminal at Washington International Airport was filled with the usual mix of hurried travelers and the echoing sounds of rolling suitcases. Through these crowds walked a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence, though today she blended perfectly with the other passengers in her simple jeans, white blouse, and comfortable walking shoes. Mrs. Patel, the owner and CEO of Skyline Airlines, was wrapping up her week-long undercover visit to different airports. She'd always believed in seeing things from the ground level, just like her father had taught her in their family's small corner store years ago. "You can't fix what you can't see," he used to say, and those words had guided her from running that single store to building one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. As she walked through the terminal, she smiled at a young boy who had dropped his toy airplane, picking it up and handing it back to him. His mother thanked her, not knowing she was interacting with the woman whose company name was painted on the actual planes outside. That's exactly how Mrs. Patel liked it. No fuss, no special treatment, just real experiences and real interactions. She'd spent the past week watching, listening, and taking mental notes about everything from how their ground staff handled delays to whether the coffee at their airport cafes was actually any good. She'd stood in lines, dealt with crowded terminals, and experienced firsthand what their passengers went through every day. Her notebook was filled with small observations that most executives might overlook, like how the seats near Gate C-15 needed reupholstering, or how the afternoon shift at the Detroit airport could use an extra customer service representative. Today was her final stop, and something felt different. Maybe it was the extra cup of coffee she'd had, or maybe it was the morning sunlight streaming through the huge terminal windows, but she had a strange feeling this visit would be memorable. She double-checked her first-class boarding pass, tucked safely in her simple leather travel wallet along with her ID. Her company badge was buried at the bottom of her bag. She hadn't needed it all week, and she hoped she wouldn't need it today either. Walking past the duty-free shops, she overheard snippets of conversations. A grandmother excited to meet her first grandchild, a young couple heading off on their honeymoon, a businessman practicing his presentation under his breath. These were the real stories of air travel, the human moments that made her love this industry despite its challenges. As she approached Gate B-23, she noticed the gate area was unusually busy for a morning flight. The previous flight had been delayed due to mechanical issues, and she could see the ripple effects in the crowd of waiting passengers. Some looked anxiously at their watches, while others had made themselves comfortable on the floor, laptops balanced on their knees. A young flight attendant was calmly answering questions, her practiced smile never wavering. Mrs. Patel checked her own watch, still plenty of time before the first-class boarding call. She found a quiet spot near the window where she could observe the controlled chaos of the tarmac below. Ground crew members in bright yellow vests directed vehicles, loaded baggage, and prepared for the next departure. From her vantage point, she could see her company's logo on the tail of the waiting aircraft, the same logo that had started as a simple sketch on a coffee shop napkin 15 years ago. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, this routine undercover visit would turn into something that would test her patience, challenge her principles, and ultimately lead to changes that would ripple through the entire airline industry. But for now, she was just another passenger, watching the morning sun glint off the wings of the aircraft, waiting for her flight to be called. The announcement for first-class boarding crackled over the speakers, and Mrs. Patel gathered her belongings, joining the small line forming at the gate. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the terminal floor, and the earlier crowd had thinned out considerably. She noticed a slight change in the usual boarding routine. Instead of the regular gate agent, a pilot was checking boarding passes. Captain Richards stood at the podium, his crisp uniform and commanding presence drawing attention from waiting passengers. He had volunteered to help with boarding after learning they were short-staffed that morning, though his tight-lipped expression suggested he wasn't too happy about it. His eyes scanned each boarding pass with the same intensity he probably used when checking his pre-flight instruments. As the line moved forward, Mrs. Patel observed how the captain interacted with each passenger. A quick nod for the businessman in the expensive suit. A warm smile for the elderly couple with matching luggage. A friendly chat with the off-duty pilot traveling home. The interactions were brief but telling, each one adding another piece to the puzzle she'd been building all week about her airline's customer service. When it was her turn, she stepped forward with her boarding pass and ID ready, just as she'd done countless times before. But something was different this time. Captain Richards barely glanced at her documents before his eyebrows furrowed. "I'll need to see those again," he said, his voice carrying across the gate area. Mrs. Patel calmly handed them back, noting how his fingers lingered over every detail of her first-class ticket. Behind her, other passengers shifted impatiently, the quiet murmur of conversation dying down as people began to notice the holdup. "There seems to be some confusion," Captain Richards said, his voice taking on a tone that made several heads turn. "Are you sure you're in the right line? General boarding hasn't started yet." He emphasized the word general in a way that made Mrs. Patel's spine stiffen slightly. A young flight attendant nearby, her Namatic read Ms. Chen, looked up from her tablet, her eyes widening in recognition. But she held her position, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. "I'd assure you, I'm in the correct line," Mrs. Patel replied softly, maintaining her composure. "That's my first-class boarding pass you're holding." The captain's face hardened. "These premium seats are usually reserved for." He paused, seemingly searching for the right words. "Well, for our frequent business travelers. Perhaps you were upgraded by mistake." The gate area had grown unusually quiet. A teenager lowered his headphones, watching the interaction with undisguised interest. An older woman clutched her handbag tighter, shaking her head slightly. A man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his own boarding pass and the scene playing out before him. Mrs. Patel felt dozens of eyes on her, but she'd faced moments like this before. In boardrooms, at business meetings, even at her own airline's shareholders' gatherings. She'd learned long ago that maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice was its own form of power. "Would you like to see my ID again?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to call your supervisor." She was giving him a chance. The same kind of chance she wished someone had given her when she was starting out, facing her own moments of doubt and prejudice. Captain Richards squared his shoulders, his face flushing slightly. "Ma'am, I'm simply trying to avoid any confusion during boarding. Perhaps if you step aside, we can sort this out after the other passengers have boarded." Behind her, someone whispered, "This isn't right." Another person had already pulled out their phone, sensing that this moment might be worth recording. The tension in the air was palpable, like the heaviness before a storm. Little did Captain Richards know, but his next few words would not only change the course of his career, but would also spark a conversation that would reach far beyond Gate B-23, far beyond this single incident on a sunny Tuesday morning. The situation at Gate B-23 was quickly becoming the kind of scene that ends up on social media. More passengers had pulled out their phones, some pretending to text while actually recording the interaction. The air felt thick with tension as Captain Richards continued to hold Mrs. Patel's boarding pass, his knuckles white against the paper. "I've shown you my boarding pass twice now," Mrs. Patel said, her voice remaining remarkably steady. "I've shown you my ID. Could you please explain exactly what the problem is?" She knew the answer, of course. She'd faced similar situations before, though never quite this blatant, never quite this public. A businessman who had been cleared to board just moments earlier stopped and turned around. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, looking between Mrs. Patel and the captain. His computer bag hung forgotten at his side, his own boarding pass still visible in his hand, the same first-class ticket that had gotten him through without a second glance. Captain Richards cleared his throat. "Sir, I'm handling this situation. Please proceed to board." But his words only drew more attention. A small crowd had formed now, their earlier rush to board temporarily forgotten. "Handling what situation?" asked an elderly woman who had been solving a crossword puzzle nearby. She closed her puzzle book and adjusted her glasses. "I've been sitting here for an hour, and I've seen you wave through everyone else in first class without so much as a glance at their IDs." Mrs. Patel watched as the captain's face reddened further. She could practically see the wheels turning in his head, searching for a way to maintain his authority while digging himself out of the hole he created. Part of her, the CEO part, was already thinking about how this would affect the airline, how it would need to be addressed. But another part, the part that remembered every slight, every mistake, every misunderstanding she'd encountered on her way to the top, wanted to see this play out. "Look," Captain Richards said, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence, "there are certain standards in first class. We need to ensure that everyone is in their proper place." He emphasized the last two words in a way that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. A young college student, who had been watching while pretending to read a book, spoke up. "Proper place? What exactly does that mean?" Her voice cracked slightly with nervousness, but she stood her ground. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like." "Young lady," Captain Richards interrupted, "this doesn't concern you." Mrs. Patel raised her hand slightly, silencing the growing murmurs of the crowd. 20 years of running board meetings had taught her the power of a quiet gesture. "Actually," she said, "I think it concerns everyone. When we stay silent in these moments, we become part of the problem." Ms. Chen, the flight attendant who had been watching everything unfold, took a step forward, then hesitated. Her hands twisted the tablet she was holding, her professional smile replaced by a look of genuine concern. "Captain," Mrs. Patel continued, her voice clear enough to carry to the back of the groaning crowd, "I'm going to ask you one more time. What exactly is the problem with my first-class ticket?" The captain looked down at the boarding pass again, then at Mrs. Patel's simple but elegant attire, then at the crowd of watchful faces surrounding them. His mouth opened and closed once, like a fish out of water. The moment stretched out, filled with the ambient sounds of the airport, distant announcements, rolling suitcases, muffled conversations, while everyone waited for his response. What he said next would either be a step toward redemption or the final nail in the coffin of his own making. The entire gate area held its breath, waiting to see which path he would choose. Ms. Chen watched the scene unfold with her heart pounding in her chest. As a flight attendant for Skyline Airlines for the past 5 years, she had attended every company training session, including the ones where Mrs. Patel herself had spoken about customer service excellence. Now, watching her CEO being denied boarding by their own pilot, she felt torn between her duty to speak up and her fear of making the situation worse. The morning sunlight streaming through the terminal windows caught the gold wings on Captain Richards' uniform as he stood there, still holding Mrs. Patel's boarding pass like it was some kind of puzzle he couldn't solve. His face had taken on an interesting shade of red, somewhere between embarrassment and stubbornness. Ms. Chen's fingers moved almost on their own, pulling out her phone and starting to record. She'd learned in training that documenting incidents was important, though she never thought she'd be recording something like this. The training videos they watched about handling difficult situations had never covered what to do when your pilot was discriminating against your CEO. "I don't understand why this is becoming such a big issue," Captain Richards said, his voice strained as he tried to maintain an air of authority. "I'm simply following protocol." But everyone within earshot knew there was no protocol that required triple-checking one passenger's documents while waving others through with barely a glance. A businessman in an expensive suit who had boarded earlier came back out to the gate area. "I couldn't just sit on the plane knowing what was happening out here," he said. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone's credentials checked this thoroughly." Ms. Chen noticed how Mrs. Patel stood perfectly still, her posture straight but not tense, her expression calm but determined. It was the same way she carried herself during company meetings when facing tough questions from shareholders. The only sign of her feelings was a slight tapping of her index finger against her leg, a gesture Ms. Chen had noticed during particularly challenging company presentations. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people from neighboring gates drawn to the scene. Some were openly recording now, their phones held up like silent witnesses. A young mother explained quietly to her curious child, "Sometimes people aren't treated fairly, and that's why we have to speak up." Ms. Chen took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. "Captain Richards, I can vouch for this passenger." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. The entire gate area seemed to hold its breath. But before she could continue, an older gentleman in the crowd spoke up. "I've been watching this whole thing, and I have to say, in all my years of traveling, I've never seen anything quite like this. Why don't you just admit what this is really about?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Phones continued recording, catching every moment, every expression, every word. Ms. Chen knew this would probably end up on social media within hours, if not minutes. She could already imagine the headlines. Captain Richards shifted his weight from one foot to the other, still holding the boarding pass like a shield. "I'm just doing my job," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "We have procedures." "Do these procedures apply to everyone?" Someone in the crowd called out. "Because it sure doesn't look like it from here." Ms. Chen watched as Mrs. Patel reached for her handbag, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The CEO's face showed no anger, no frustration. Just a calm determination that Ms. Chen had seen before, usually right before Mrs. Patel announced something that would change the company for the better. This moment, Ms. Chen realized, was about to become one of those turning points, not just for Captain Richards, but for the entire airline. She steadied her phone, making sure to capture whatever was about to happen next, knowing that sometimes the most important changes start with one person simply standing their ground. The tension at Gate B23 had reached its breaking point. Every eye was fixed on Mrs. Patel as she calmly opened her handbag. The morning sunlight streaming through the terminal windows seemed to pause, as if even nature was holding its breath to see what would happen next. "Captain Richards," Mrs. Patel said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed gate area, "you seem very concerned about whether I belong in first class. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt what it's like to be questioned about belonging somewhere?" The captain's face twitched slightly. A few people in the crowd nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Years of similar experiences reflected in their eyes. "I'm simply following protocol," Captain Richards repeated, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. He sounded more like someone reciting a line they no longer believed in. "Are you?" Mrs. Patel asked. "Because I've been watching." The businessman in the blue suit, you barely looked at his boarding pass. The couple with matching luggage, you waved them through with a smile. The off-duty pilot, you had a whole conversation about golf. But me? I've had to show my documents 3 times now. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "She's right," and others nodded. The young college student who had spoken up earlier was furiously typing on her phone, probably sharing the story on social media. "Ma'am, if you're confused about the boarding process," Captain Richards started, but Mrs. Patel held up her hand. "I'm not confused at all," she said. "In fact, I understand exactly what's happening here. And you know what? This is actually a perfect teaching moment." She reached deeper into her bag, and everyone leaned forward slightly, wondering what she would pull out. "Tell me, Captain," she continued, "how long have you been with Skyline Airlines?" The question seemed to throw him off balance. 12 years, he answered automatically. 12 years, Mrs. Patel repeated thoughtfully. That's quite a while. So you must be familiar with the company's leadership. Captain Richards straightened his uniform jacket. Of course I am. Really? Mrs. Patel's eyebrow raised slightly. All of the leadership. The flight attendant, Ms. Chen, was still recording everything, but now a small smile had started to form on her face. She knew what was coming. Mrs. Patel finally pulled something from her bag, a small leather wallet. Not her regular ID that she'd shown earlier, but something else. The crowd watched as she opened it slowly, deliberately. You see, Captain Richards, I've been traveling to all our major hubs this week. Watching, observing, learning. I wanted to see how our passengers were being treated when nobody knew who was watching. And I have to say, this has been educational. She pulled out a card and held it up. The gold lettering caught the sunlight, making it gleam. Perhaps this will help clear up any confusion about whether I belong in first class. Captain Richards reached for the card, his hand trembling slightly. As he read it, all the color drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. A child in the crowd tugged on his mother's sleeve. What does it say? He asked loudly in that way only children can. His mother shushed him, but everyone was wondering the same thing. Would you like to read it aloud? Mrs. Patel asked kindly, or should I? The card shook visibly in Captain Richards' hand. The crowd watched as the realization of what was happening, of who he had been treating so dismissively, dawned on his face. In that moment, he looked like he wished the ground would open up and swallow him whole. The airport's usual sounds seemed far away now, the distant announcements, the rolling suitcases, the hum of conversations. All of it faded into background noise as everyone waited to hear what would happen next. The truth was about to come out, and everyone knew this moment would be remembered for a long time to come. The gold-lettered business card trembled in Captain Richards' hands as his eyes moved across the text again and again, as if hoping the words might somehow change. The crowd at Gate B-23 leaned forward, waiting for someone to break the heavy silence. Captain Richards stammered, his face now a shade paler than his crisp white uniform shirt. The business card in his hand read, Chief Executive Officer, Skyline Airlines, above Mrs. Patel's name and credentials. Go ahead, Mrs. Patel said gently. I think everyone here deserves to know exactly who you've been trying to keep out of first class. A quiet gasp rippled through the crowd as understanding dawned. The young college student who had been documenting everything whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough for those nearby to hear. The businessman who had returned from the plane shook his head, a mix of amazement and satisfaction on his face. This is, your Captain Richards could barely form a complete sentence. The authority he had wielded so confidently just minutes ago had evaporated like morning dew in the sunlight streaming through the terminal windows. I'm the owner and CEO of Skyline Airlines. Mrs. Patel finished for him, her voice clear and steady. The airline whose plane you're standing in front of. The company whose uniform you're wearing. The business whose first-class ticket you seem to think I don't deserve to hold. The silence that followed was deafening. Someone in the back of the crowd let out a low whistle. Ms. Chen, still recording, had tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from pride in watching her CEO handle this situation with such grace and dignity. Mrs. Patel, I had no idea, Captain Richards managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands were still shaking as he tried to hand back both the business card and the boarding pass. That's exactly the point, isn't it? Mrs. Patel said, accepting her items back. You had no idea who I was, so you made assumptions. You decided, based on nothing but how I look, that I couldn't possibly belong in first class. The older woman with the crossword puzzle nodded vigorously. Give it to him, dear, she encouraged, voicing what many in the crowd were thinking. But here's what's interesting, Mrs. Patel continued, addressing not just the captain, but everyone gathered around. This isn't about me being the CEO. I shouldn't have to own the airline to be treated with respect. No one should have to prove they're important enough to be treated with basic dignity. Phones were still recording, capturing every word. In the back of the crowd, a father lifted his young daughter onto his shoulders so she could see better, knowing she was watching a moment she'd remember for years to come. "So, Captain Richards," Mrs. Patel said, straightening her simple blazer, "what do you think we should do about this situation?" The captain looked like he wanted to disappear into thin air. His eyes darted around, perhaps searching for an escape route, finding none. The crowd waited, many holding their breath, to see how he would respond to this moment of truth. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the terminal floor. In the distance, a plane could be heard taking off, its engines roaring with power. But here at Gate B-23, time seemed to stand still as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Captain Richards opened his mouth to respond, knowing his next words could either begin to repair the damage he'd done or make everything much, much worse. The entire gate area hung on what he would say next, aware they were witnessing something that would likely be talked about for years to come. Captain Richard's hands fidgeted with his uniform collar as every eye in Gate B-23 focused on him. The morning had started like any other day, but now he found himself in a situation that would likely define his entire career. "Mrs. Patel," he began, his voice barely steady, I owe you an apology." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I know that's not enough." The crowd watched as the CEO of Skyline Airlines stood quietly, waiting. The phone cameras were still recording, capturing what was quickly becoming a viral moment in airline history. "You're right," Captain Richards continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "I made assumptions. I treated you differently than other passengers, and there's no excuse for that. None at all." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Mrs. Patel nodded slowly. "Recognition is the first step," she said. "But you're right. An apology alone isn't enough. What do you think should happen next?" The businessman who had spoken up earlier crossed his arms, waiting. The young college student had stopped typing on her phone, her full attention on the scene unfolding before her. Even the usual airport announcements seemed muted, as if the terminal itself was listening. Captain Richards looked around at the faces watching him, some angry, some disappointed, some hopeful. "I need to do better. We all need to do better." He straightened his shoulders, finally meeting Mrs. Patel's eyes directly. "I'll accept whatever consequences come from this. But more than that, I want to be part of the change." A subtle shift occurred in Mrs. Patel's expression. Not quite a smile, but something close to approval. She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the gate area. "What's happened here today isn't unique. It happens every day in airports, stores, offices, and streets across the country. The only difference is that today, it happened to someone who can do something about it." Ms. Chen stepped forward, still holding her phone. "Mrs. Patel, the whole thing is recorded. Should I send it to HR?" "Yes," Mrs. Patel replied, "but not for the reasons people might think." She turned back to Captain Richards. "This isn't going to end with a firing. That's too easy. Instead, this is going to be the beginning of something important." The tension in the air began to shift into something else. Curiosity, perhaps even hope. The older woman with the crossword puzzle dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The young mother who had been explaining things to her child smiled softly. "Captain Richards," Mrs. Patel continued, "starting next week, you're going to help develop our new training program. Your experience today, your mistakes, your recognition of them, and what happens next will be part of teaching others to do better." The captain's eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't the punishment he'd expected. "You want me to share this story, help others learn from it, be part of making real change." Mrs. Patel's voice was firm but kind. Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons themselves. The crowd murmured in approval. Someone started clapping, and soon others joined in. Not thunderous applause, but the quiet, respectful kind that acknowledges a moment of genuine human growth. "Now," Mrs. Patel said, reaching for her boarding pass, "I believe we have a plane to board, and I'm quite sure my first-class ticket won't be questioned this time." A few people chuckled, breaking the last of the tension. As the regular boarding process resumed, passengers began moving forward, but everyone knew they had just witnessed something more important than a simple airline incident. They had seen how a moment of prejudice could be transformed into an opportunity for change. 3 months after the incident at Gate B-23, Skyline Airlines' main training center buzzed with activity. The room was packed with pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff. All eyes focused on the front where Captain Richards stood, sharing his story for the 100th time, but with the same humility as the first. "I thought I knew what good customer service meant," he told the room, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "But that morning taught me that our unconscious beliefs can blind us to our own behavior." He clicked to the next slide, showing the now familiar scene from the terminal. The video from that day had indeed gone viral, but not in the way most viral airport videos do. Instead of being just another scandal, it had become a story of transformation. Mrs. Patel's handling of the situation had been praised by business leaders worldwide, and Skyline Airlines had turned a potentially devastating moment into an opportunity for real change. In the back of the training room, Mrs. Patel quietly slipped in, wearing the same kind of simple, professional attire she'd worn that day. She watched as Captain Richards continued his presentation, noting how the room leaned forward when he spoke, how people nodded in recognition of their own hidden biases. "The hardest part wasn't facing my mistakes," Captain Richards explained, his voice steady. "It was realizing how many times I must have done similar things without even noticing. How many people had I hurt without ever knowing?" A young flight attendant raised her hand. "How do you handle the shame of knowing you were wrong?" she asked, her voice slightly trembling. Captain Richards smiled gently. "By remembering that shame doesn't help anyone. What helps is learning, changing, and teaching others to do better." He gestured to a stack of new training manuals on the table. "That's why we're all here today." The new training program had become a model for other airlines. It went beyond the usual corporate diversity training, using real experiences and honest conversations to create lasting change. Staff members were encouraged to share their own stories, both of facing prejudice and of recognizing their own biases. At the coffee station outside the training room, 2 ground crew members discussed their morning session. "You know what's different about this training?" one said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "It feels real. It's not just about checking boxes or avoiding lawsuits." Mrs. Patel smiled to herself as she overheard their conversation. The changes hadn't stopped with training. The airline had revised its hiring practices, promoted more diverse voices to leadership positions, and created a customer service approach that emphasized dignity and respect for everyone. Back in the training room, Captain Richards was wrapping up his session. "Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our biggest mistakes," he said, clicking to his final slide. "But it's what we do after those mistakes that really matters." The screen showed a recent photo. Captain Richards and Mrs. Patel standing together at a national aviation conference, where Skyline Airlines had just received an award for its groundbreaking approach to corporate culture change. The photo captured something remarkable. 2 people who had started as adversaries now standing as partners in progress. As the session ended and people began to file out, many stopped to share their own stories with Captain Richards. Each conversation, each shared experience, added another thread to the tapestry of change that had started that morning at Gate B-23. Mrs. Patel watched it all from her quiet spot in the back, remembering her father's words about seeing things from ground level. She had always believed that real change started with individual moments of truth. That day at the gate had proved her right, though not in the way anyone might have expected. 1 year after the incident at Gate B-23, Mrs. Patel stood at a podium in a packed conference hall. Business leaders from airlines around the world had gathered to learn about what the media had dubbed the skyline transformation. Change doesn't always come from grand plans or corporate initiatives, she began, her voice warm and confident. Sometimes it comes from a single moment when someone is brave enough to admit they were wrong, and someone else is strong enough to turn that mistake into an opportunity. In the front row, Captain Richards sat straight and proud in his uniform. The past year had changed him in ways he never expected. He'd have become a sought-after speaker on corporate culture change, sharing his story with companies far beyond the airline industry. Our story could have ended very differently. Mrs. Patel continued, clicking through slides that showed Skyline's remarkable progress. It could have been just another viral video, another public firing, another moment of outrage that faded into memory. Instead, it became something more. The screen behind her displayed statistics that told a powerful story. Customer satisfaction scores had risen by 40%. Employee retention had improved significantly. Skyline had been named one of the best places to work, and their training program had won multiple awards. But numbers don't tell the real story, Mrs. Patel said, putting down her notes. The real story is in the letters we receive, the conversations we hear, the changes we see every day in our terminals and on our planes. She shared a recent example. A young girl traveling alone had been nervous about her first flight. The gate agent, inspired by the new training program, had taken extra time to make her feel welcome. That girl had written to the airline, saying she now wanted to become a pilot. This is how change spreads, Mrs. Patel explained, her eyes scanning the audience. One person, one moment, one choice at a time. The presentation shifted to a series of photographs. Staff members from all levels of the company sharing their stories during training sessions, crews celebrating diversity milestones, passengers writing thank you notes to staff who had made them feel valued and respected. In the back of the hall, Ms. Chen, now promoted to head of customer experience, smiled as she remembered that morning at Gate B23. Her phone video had become part of the training material, but more importantly, it had become part of a larger story about how organizations could transform themselves. Today, when I walk through our terminals, Mrs. Patel continued, I see something different. I see people truly seeing each other. I see staff members who understand that every interaction is an opportunity to make someone feel valued. Captain Richards stood up when Mrs. Patel invited him to join her on stage. Together, they represented something powerful. The possibility of change, the importance of accountability, and the strength that comes from turning a difficult moment into an opportunity for growth. We're not perfect, Mrs. Patel concluded, but we're committed to doing better every day. And we've learned that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a simple question. Why am I making this assumption? As the audience rose for a standing ovation, Mrs. Patel looked out at the sea of faces and remembered that morning at Gate B23. She thought about how a moment that could have divided people had instead brought them together, how confrontation had become a conversation, and how a mistake had become a mission. The applause echoed through the hall, but it wasn't just for her or for Captain Richards. It was for every person who had ever stood up against prejudice, for every organization trying to do better, and for the simple but powerful idea that change is always possible when people are willing to learn, grow, and work together.